Okay, so could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Richard Calderon. Everybody calls me Dick Calderon. And I'm 84 years old. 85, excuse me. I just had a birthday the other day. And I'm married, of course, to my wife Nancy since 1956. Well, that's a few years. And I used to be a teacher, an English teacher, many years ago, primarily in Marblehead at the high school. And then after quite a few years of teaching English, I became a guidance counselor. And I did that until the time I retired. I retired in 1991. So that's been a few years ago. So that's basically it. I'm a veteran. I was in the Korean War. I was in a fighter squadron, Navy, and sailed aboard the Bonhomme Richard, which was an Essex-class aircraft carrier. And we went to, from California is where we left, and went to Hawaii, out to Japan, and then from Japan we went off the coast of Korea, and we were out off the coast of Korea approximately 6 months with our airplanes were attacking the North Koreans. And then came back again, and basically that was my veteran stuff. I've been active in the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Also, I'm a past commander of the local chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Were you ever afraid that the Cold War would turn into a hot war? At what point in the war were you most afraid?
Well, I wouldn't say that I was afraid that it would become a hot war. Of course, it was on the news all the time, everything that was happening, and we certainly were aware of everything that was going on. You couldn't miss it. And that started really, basically, it began to start right after World War II. So, and continued right up until Gorbachev over in Russia, who finally swung the country around, became president, and the country was no longer a union of Soviet socialist republics. It was just the state of Russia. And he really opened up the country. This is later in the whole Cold War sequence of events. But he was a very important person, I think, amongst a few others, who opened up the country. And as you know, I was an amateur radio operator, and back in those days, when I was making contact with people all around the world, other amateur radio operators, during that time, if you tried to contact anybody by written form in Russia, you couldn't do that. They didn't permit that. So, whereas in every other country you were able to make contacts and send these little cards that we used to have. This is a card, we call that a QSL card, which means it's just a souvenir of a conversation that you had with somebody around the world. So I've got hundreds and hundreds of these things from all over the world, places that I've contacted. So no, I wasn't really that worried that it would become a hot war. Not at that point anyway, yeah.
What was the American view of Russia? Did books and movies criticize the Soviet Union?
I don't know that I would say that they criticized it particularly. I mean, I think everybody that I was aware of knew that their system of communism was not a good system. I mean, everybody had to do exactly what the government wanted, and that's the way it was, unlike over here. In fact, I had one one friend of mine, Nicholas Kalmakoff was his name, amateur radio operator, and I was in touch with him over a pretty long time. Finally was able to write letters to him and everything and get some letters back, whereas in the very beginning I couldn't do that. You could talk to them on the radio, but even then you had to be very careful about what you said. You didn't say anything bad about the Russians. I mean, the idea was to make friends with people that you met. And a lot of those people, Russian amateur radio operators, did that. So I'm sure that over the years I contacted dozens and dozens of them over the years.
What did your school teach about the Soviet Union? Did you ever feel threatened by communism?
I wouldn't say that I felt threatened in this country. There were a few people in the country who I think had these communist views, they were really not that many people like that. But there were some in our country, communists, and who thought that that was a good system. And of course, I think the majority of us didn't think it was a very good system. I think the main reason that anyone would ever think communism was good was that one thing that they did do was they provided a lot of things for the people in the country. They provided medical care, schooling, and they did a lot of things of that nature. But they were very oppressive. If you disagreed with what the government wanted to do, they didn't put up with that. They had what they call stalags, which was a company, like a camp, like a concentration camp almost. And people that did things that they didn't like in Russia at that time, if you really tried to fight against the way things were done, they would put you into jail, put you into labor camps, and so forth. So we never had that kind of problem, of course, in any of the democratic countries, which included, most of the countries in the world. So that was a problem, and so.
Could you talk any more about your time on the amateur radio and your friendship with Nicholas?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that one. My hearing is very poor.
Could you talk any more about the time on the amateur radio and your friendship with Nicholas?
Yeah, I talked with him. We never talked very much about what was happening in the country, to be very honest with you. We knew what he was doing as a family. As a matter of fact, Nick worked in an industrial complex, a factory, and had a sort of a technical job. His wife, Galina was her real name, but Galia was the nickname. Galia is a professor in the university that they had right there in Russia where they lived. Ulyanovsk was the name of the city, which is, I would say it's going to be, maybe 100 miles east of Moscow, and about the same latitude. But so she was a professor at that college, and she taught German and English. And at one time, she was quite interested, perhaps, in getting a job over here, either here or in Canada, someplace like that. Not a permanent job, but to come over here and maybe spend some time at an American college and teach. Now, when I was in a Navy squadron called VF-72, that was the name of it, that's a fighter squadron. Before I ever got into that squadron, and when I joined the Navy, when the Korean War started, in 1951, in January actually, I enlisted, and I went to boot camp in Rhode Island for 3 months where they teach all the basic things. It's like boot camp in the Army. And then they sent me to electronics school down in Tennessee, of all places. And I was there for 6 months solid, going to school every single day, going to class, taking notes, doing the experiments and everything with electronics. So when I get through with that, then I had the opportunity to see where I was going to go from there. And I went to this Navy fighter squadron, which, as it turned out, was located up in Rhode Island, Quonset Point, Rhode Island, which was a naval air station. So I was there for a period of time, and then we were shipped onto a train, a troop train, and we went along, not just my squadron, but there were a half dozen squadrons, plus all of their mechanical equipment and everything that they had to bring along, plus the pilots flew their airplanes all the way from Quonset Point, Rhode Island, all the way to San Diego in California. And we went aboard the ship, which the huge aircraft carrier. We had probably, I'd say, between 2,000 and 3,000 sailors living on that ship. That's how big it was. And we probably had in the vicinity of 50 or 60 airplanes on it. And the planes were usually kept in what we call the hangar deck. That was one below the flight deck. So the hangar deck was where they would be normally stored, repaired, and all that kind of thing. Then they would move them out onto an elevator that would stick outside side of the ship. So they'd come off onto that and up onto the flight deck, and their engines would start up with a Jeep that had to start their jet engines, plug in electricity and so forth and get the thing going. And for a while, amongst other things, I drove one of those Jeeps and would start these planes up, and then they would go out onto the flight deck, get onto a catapult, they'd hook them up there. There would be 2 of these, and then off they would go. And I would keep starting these planes as they would come up and go onto the flight deck. So it was kind of a dangerous spot, actually, which I won't get into, but we had an accident on the deck there. A plane didn't crash or anything. What happened was the plane pulled off the elevator onto the main deck, flight deck, and hooked up. And as he was pulling off like that, the jet blast hit a couple of guys that were standing on this elevator. They were standing on it to come up, and blew one of them right off the side. And fortunately, they picked him up with the helicopters that they always kept going up there when anything was going on. And so he was okay. Another guy, it blew me out of the seat of my Jeep. Fortunately, I didn't go off. I just went down and didn't have to. And then my Jeep rolled back and ran into another guy and broke his hip. Fortunately, it didn't kill him. And they just took him, put him on a stretcher into the sick bay. Later on, they hooked him up on a wire from this ship onto a destroyer, which is a smaller ship. And then they took that eventually to Japan, to a hospital there where they worked on. So he was okay finally. So it was kind of exciting, and I was able to see quite a lot. Later on, after the war was over, I spent I had another big cruise that went to the Mediterranean, and we were 6 months in the Mediterranean. So I was able to visit Spain, went to France, went to a couple of places in Italy, Sicily, and went over to Greece. Went over to Athens, saw Athens. We had to get off the ship, obviously. And then we went to Constantinople, Istanbul, or the capital of Turkey. And in all of these places that I went when I was in the Navy, overseas like that, was fantastic to see things, Roman walls, and in Italy or in Turkey for that matter, you'd see them, remains of all of that stuff in those days. It was fascinating. And in Japan, when I grew up during the war, we always learned that the Japanese were horrible, terrible people. They killed our soldiers, which they did, in the wars, the way wars go. But when I got over there, this was of course after World War II, and was able to meet Japanese people. They're wonderful people, friendly, polite, hardworking, and I really got to like the Japanese people a lot, and I still do. And of course, there's one of our greatest allies in the Pacific, the Japanese, who had their emperor and everything was military and all, and now after we finished over there, became a democracy, and today it's one of the foremost countries in the world, really, which is a wonderful thing. The same happened with Germany after the war, and so forth. So the things aren't so good right now, of course, over in Russia, where Putin, I think, is kind of he used to be head of the Secret Service back in Russia earlier when he was younger. And he's that kind of a person type, I think you have to call him. He's he wants things the way he wants it. And that's the way it is, and it's kind of too bad that it's getting to this point. And I don't think there'll be a war, certainly, but I think most of the countries in Europe are going to are not happy to see Ukraine, which is an established independent country now, never was, of course, back in the old Russian days. It was part of Russia, but it's a democratic country, and now they're coming into there, and there were, of course, a lot of Russians who always lived there, and I think a lot of them, apparently, feel like, they're just as happy to see them back in with Russia as part of Russia, the Crimea. Of course, that's only one part of the Ukraine anyway. And I think one of the reasons was because in Sevastopol, I believe it's called, they have a big Navy base there. And the Russians have always had it there. They had permission to be there. It was theirs originally. And the Ukrainian Navy had ships there too. But that's what they want to hang on to, because that is right on the Black Sea, and of course the Black Sea is a big sea down in there, and it's got, it's connected to a lot of places that they would have some interest in, not necessarily to conquer them, but so that's it.
What lessons did you learn from the Cold War? Did your experience have any long-term effects on your life?
Did the Cold War have effects? I guess it probably did, because, I graduated from high school in 1947, and World War II ended 2 years before that. So I was a sophomore in high school when World War II ended. And so then as things began to heat up and everything, and we saw what was going on in Korea, the Chinese, of course, became communists. The nationalists were thrown out, Chiang Kai-shek and them, and they became a communist country. And they exerted their influence on the Koreans, and of course there were communist Koreans there too. And they decided they're going to take over the whole country of Korea. And that's when the war started, and we didn't want that to happen. When the war ended there, it was sort of like communists on the top, pretty much, and anyway, they finally had that war, which never really went anyplace. It ended the same place with the North Koreans north and with the Republic of Korea underneath. And the Koreans, of course, even today, they're good. They have good relationship with Japan and other democratic countries, and so they would like to, I think, they've only recently begun to permit in North Korea people who were separated by that war, relatives living up here and others down here in South Korea. They've permitted a few of them to come up and visit their friends, well, relatives, which they hadn't seen since the war ended. I mean, we're talking about little kids visiting their other little kids in those days. Now they're old people, like me, and having visits with them. And that's not as much as everyone would like to see, but occasionally it happens. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question. My mind sort of wanders off onto different things. It's kind of hard sometimes.
Anything else to add, or you all set?
No, I think that's about the story.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Was that a history lesson?